Hi everyone, Ameer from APIMatic. I look after strategy and business development. So, yeah, right. So I'd be talking about API adoption driven by SDKs as opposed to integrations. And we'll be looking at how to develop a business case around it. So I'd pretty much start with a question with the audience that how many of you have ever faced sort of a budget issue with the top management in terms of the current project that they're working on or are proposing a new project? So not surprising, pretty much almost half the crowd, right? So so in startup selling, we have a saying that if a sales rep comes to you and says, "Hey, I lost a lead because the client didn't have enough budget for it," it's said that it's pretty much a fireable offense because it's usually never a budget issue. It's because you failed. The assumption is you failed to basically convey the value of the product to the customer. Of course, we're assuming that there's a product market fit. You're not trying to sell air conditioners in the North Pole. But if that is the case, then I think when you're talking about your project or your developer experience project, SDKs in this case, and taking it to your management, you're a sales rep of your project as well. And same analogy applies. And the thing is that it should always be a value debate, not a budget debate. So it should not be we don't have money for it, but is there value in there for that money or not? And again, I think that's where the concept of business case comes in. So a typical business case, we're going to take a simple step process. It starts with setting up, of course, your goal or setting up a scope, what you want to achieve. And then you go into a sort of a cost-benefit analysis where you see where pros versus cons, the risks involved. And then you see what are the possible options where you can sort of minimize the cost while maximize the benefits out of it. And of course, project an impact on business that you can take to the decision makers in terms of getting the project approved. So starting from the goal, here again, your goal is, of course, increase in API adoption, again, by achieving an amazing developer experience. I could have mentioned, increase in API monetization, but then there are different models because if you're having an API as a product, then you have a different monetization model, and if you have an ecosystem API, you would have a different monetization model for that matter. So let's, for argument's sake, say the goal is API adoption. In terms of amazing developer experience, how do you define that? Yesterday, Bill, in his keynote speech, also talked about this. This is a quote from Adil, who's also from APIMatic. And he goes, if you're letting your developers focus on what's creative and taking out what's redundant from their life, you're providing a good developer experience to your developers. So basically, there's a checklist by API Evangelist, Ken Lane. These are the components that you basically need to have to start with a good developer experience. I'm pretty sure if some of you who are already having public APIs must have at least a few of this upper ticks done already. But when it comes to SDKs and code samples, that's when the things start to get tricky because there are a bit of complications get involved. And let's see how the world is doing it. So these are some of the top APIs, a bit of survey that we did a while ago, but we recently updated it. So if you look at the top APIs, all of them are providing SDKs. And it's not just SDKs. It's just an ecosystem of support around it, which includes tutorials, code samples for those SDKs, getting started guides, and so on and so forth. So one thing becomes clear. Okay, SDKs are sort of an integral component of good developer experience, but SDK alone do not do the job completely. You have to have a support system with other components as well. And if you deep dive into SDKs, we at APIMatic have been dealing with SDKs for over 4 years now. And we think that just handling the HTTP call with serialization and deserialization doesn't suffice the definition of SDK, because if you can do more for the developer, why leave it to them to sort it out? So we believe that sorting out caches, retries, analytics, validation, authentication, things like that should be covered in an SDK. So in terms of coming back to defining the goal and sort of scope for SDKs, these last two slides basically define it. So it has to be, the SDK has to be comprehensive and has to come with sort of an ecosystem of code samples and guides and other documentation around it. So now let's get on with the benefits, so pros of having SDKs. Why? Well, of course, with SDKs, client libraries in multiple languages, you could reach out to wider communities of developers. You could speak their language and sort of ease them into better API adoption. The other, of course, could be faster development time, because now you're getting a lot of work done for the developers to sort of communicate with your API, to consume your API. That increases or stimulates the development time for them. The other thing, of course, consistent consumption across APIs and across teams. Now, assume that your client is using one of your APIs. Let's say you're a fintech company and the client's using your payment APIs. Having SDKs actually helps you standardize. So for example, when they sort of try to, are willing to upsell and sort of get another API, let's say billing API, they don't get a different experience. They get that consistent experience. So apple to apple. And so is the case with if you multiple teams from your client are consuming same API, they get sort of that consistent experience. And if you have SDKs, there would be no oranges here. Although, of course, all use cases are different, but still will be apples, right? And the other sort of value that SDKs bring to the table, and then you need to think about when you're thinking about getting SDKs up for your APIs, is that it makes changes very easy. So you don't need to change a lot of code. You just make one change, and then it gets reflected in the SDKs. Or in other words, if I try to put it the other way, let's say your endpoint changes, right? If you don't provide SDKs, developers can go back to your documentation, get to know about them, and sort of work them in their application. But if you provide SDKs, that sort of accelerate the process. So all in all these 4 components, of course, add value sort of in your API adoption through SDKs. But then there are things, of course, you have to think about when you're when you're trying to think about SDKs as generating value for yourself. For example, for reaching wider communities, you have to think about how many languages would be relevant for you. For example, if your API is only accessed by mobile platforms, there's no point in having, for example, a Python library. So you'd have to stick to Android, iOS, or Swift, for example. In terms of faster development time, if you've got more competition going on, so you have to sort of think about that and add that in the SDK value. In terms of consistent composition, so if you move across this axis towards the upper right quadrant, as your client's use cases become complex, value of SDKs become sort of more relevant to your use case. And in terms of making changes easy, of course, if your API changes very frequently, that could be one of the reasons where you should be going for an SDK, because that's where the value would be coming from. So what are the risks involved if you don't do SDKs? Of course, losing your customers to competition, because of course you're losing out on developer experience. And there's the other risk that I really want to talk about is jeopardizing earlier investments. So what do I mean by that? So you've spent a lot of time in sort of designing wonderful APIs and wonderful structures that reflect business value of your API offerings. But if you don't provide good access to that wonderful structure, so you're sort of losing out on a lot of investment in terms of time and effort made on designing those APIs. So, having sort of a weak consumption structure basically hits back on the value of initial investment on sort of developing an API structure in the first place. Again, the decision, how do you go about maintaining, getting SDKs done? Well, there of course are two ways. One's manual, the other's automate. During the last 4 years, we've seen, even in the manual sort of regime, we've seen a lot of use cases. So what are the options that companies have been using? Of course, to build an in-house team that sort of develops from ground up. The other option is you could outsource it, get it outsourced, get it made one time, but then of course that's mostly for static sort of APIs, because as soon as things change, you're in trouble. The other option is you outsource it to contractors ongoing and get continued support. And the fourth option is get community support. We see a lot of APIs doing that because you get it for free, right? But then there are caveats attached to it, as so when some sort of an urgent update is required, or there's a security vulnerability that you discovered, you have to it's not in your control. You have to rely on community for that, right? So there are some problems to doing things manually. Instead of getting into these, I'd really like to talk about some other costs while you're doing it manually. Two sort of very visible costs and one hidden cost. So, of course, one of them is development costs. So, if you're building it from scratch, you would have to invest. Some development time over it. So, let's take a very simple example. Let's say for one simple small API, you are looking for building one client library in one language. It takes on average, let's say, 2 weeks of development time. Multiply that by a standard rate, you get this amount, 1852. In terms of maintenance, well, it actually depends on how big your API is, number of endpoints, how frequently it gets updated. But for assumption's sake, let's assume that it takes 2 days a month. So add that up, it goes to around 8,000. Combine that for the year, it's around 11,000. You see 80% of the cost is now from the maintenance bit of it. So if I plot that across, say, multiple APIs, if you look at this graph on the orange line, it goes from 11K to 100K. And as soon as I start adding APIs to it, the graph sort of starts to fan out, of course. And it's not necessarily a linear curve, because as soon as the complexity increases, it could be exponential cost in terms of you might have to hire more PMs, for example, have to throw in probably more of development efforts in sort of keeping everything in sync. So moving on to the next cost, time to market. So if you're building versus automate, you have to go through, if you're doing it for the first time, you have to go through a series of process in terms of designing the SDK, getting the development done, testing, getting the docs ready, and then ultimately going on to publish. In terms of automation, you see, there's the blue bit is still there. So initially, in the first time, to get the automation right, you do have to spend some time sort of getting the design right. For example, your API spec. because the quality of automation, of course, it depends a lot on how good your specification is. But when it comes to subsequent releases, automation kills pretty much, beats building by far. So the third cost that I want to talk about is sort of a hidden cost in that sense. So what developers should be doing, right? In terms of consumption side, they should be busy in designing and developing wonderful apps. In terms of provider side, they should be busy in designing wonderful APIs which these apps consume. So technically the creative bit. But what they end up doing? They end up doing the redundant tasks in terms of, consumer side, doing the logic and authentication and whatnot, and on the provider side, doing SDKs by hand, code samples, and everything. So the thing is that automation basically can take care of this, but the cost here is that the opportunity cost that these developers could have been doing in terms of creating new products, developing those APIs, and that's the actual loss that you're going to hit on your roadmap. So the impact, you get better API adoption with SDKs. You let developers focus on what's creative. These 2 points I've talked about, but the other thing is automation just doesn't stop there. So it opens new avenues which building manually doesn't have. So for example, this is sort of a flow that we've been working on for a while now. Initially, we were only focused on generating SDKs and transformations. But because we were automating, we were able to add a lot of services around for our clients in terms of extending the developer experience value chain. So from transformation, where developers can, working on different API specs, can bring in their API, whatever format they are. We support all formats. Then there's an overlay layer where technical writers can come in and contribute the human aspect of the documentation. And then we all stitch all those API specs into one single API specification, where we are able to generate SDKs, docs, and other developer experience components in sort of a consolidated manner. And since it's all auto-generated, the good thing about it is then that we were able to filter it out and provide specific views for different segments. For example, external developers would have a different, you would want to expose different endpoints to them. You would want to expose different endpoints to your partners. And for example, internally, you would have a different holistic view. So it's just because of this automation that we were able to create this sort of value chain for customers, one of which is actually present here, but you can't take the name because of legal issues, because they haven't launched it in the market yet. But so concluding, automation of SDKs can create a lot of value. And if you want to take one thing from this presentation, the takeaway would be that it's all about value. If you deliver your value, if you're able to convince that the project is generating value in terms of developer experience, in terms of, I think you're in the right place, and you'll be able to sort of get the project done. Thank you.